Hello, my name is Talip Küçükcan. I would like to welcome you to the TRT World Forum this year. Today, we have a special session on racism, culture wars, and the polarization of global politics. As you follow the world events, there is a growing trend in the global world as far as polarization is concerned on the basis of religion, ethnicity, class, and color. And this is posing a risk for the international community as far as stability is concerned. Today, we will be looking at such issues and whether there could be any remedies, the reasons and implications of the polarization that is taking place, not in the context of nation states only, but on the global level. So we have got excellent line of speakers today. Salman Sayyid is with us, who is a professor of social theory and decolonial thought at the University of Leeds. We have also Nadia Abu-Zahra, who is associate professor and the joint chair of women's studies at the University of Ottawa and Carleton University. We have got Mr. Alvaro Rodriguez, a UN officer in charge of Turkey. We have also Khaled Beydoun, who is a law professor at Wayne State University. And also we have got excellent discussants that I will mention their names and affiliation later on. I would like to welcome all of you to our session on the racism, cultural wars, and polarization of global politics. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and I hope that we will have a very fruitful discussion and debate today. I would like to start with Salman Sayyid with a general question to set a framework for our discussion, actually. Salman Sayyid, what is behind the seemingly widespread phenomenon of political and social polarization across much of the world today? Are there purely local explanations, or are there global trends that can account for this phenomenon? The floor is yours, and you've got 5 to 8 minutes for your thoughts to share with us, Salman. Can you please turn your mic on?
Thank you very much for that question, and thank you for the invitation. I'm really glad to be here. I think the two parts to this question. Firstly, there's clearly global elements to the condition that you describe, but those global elements reinforce local and regional trends. So it's not either or. I think the first and most important global element really is that there is a fundamental convergence or agreement across the planet about how economies, societies should ideally be organized. In a sense, people would call this kind of neoliberalism, which has both an economic and a cultural aspect, and there's a convergence around that. So in a way, when you have this convergence, it means ways of thinking beyond neoliberalism become very, very difficult. You have the ability to debate or discuss ideas which are different, becomes difficult. And you have, oddly enough, this agreement and consensus produces not a peaceful settlement, it actually produces more and more tensions because certain types of things, certain ways of being cannot be expressed or cannot be particularly discussed or debated or even imagined. So in one way to think about this is a kind of a closure of our imagination. If you think back on the Cold War, you had a major ideological struggle about ways people should live, organized around the Soviet camp or the United States camp. And it was a major organizing principle. And in that conflict between these two poles, it was possible to develop third ways, different positions around, for example, a third world, around emancipation, anti-colonial struggles, etc. When you have no other alternative, then what do you do if you don't feel that you are part of the system as it's presently conceived? Where do you go to? Now, that, it seems to me, is an overarching phenomenon that affects everyone on the planet. But I would say that there are certain groups and populations which experience this with a greater intensity. And one group, I would say to you, is the population which is increasingly described and describes itself as being Muslim in some way. This is not an issue about their religiosity or how observant they are. It's simply the way that there's a way of thinking about Muslimness that perhaps didn't exist 40 years ago or 50 years ago. Now, the issue right now is this, that you have a situation in where the issues that affect Muslims find it very difficult to be addressed in any of the governing structures that exist currently. To give you two examples, if you look at some of the incredibly harsh legislation and measures being introduced in democratic countries of the European Union, like for example France, and you compare them to things which have happened in other countries, like in India or China or Burma or Palestine, all of these issues, there is not such a huge difference as we used to think. So you have organizations which, for example, fight against racism and colonialism and Islamophobia in France being shut down. You have similar, any organizations or voices which further expressions of Muslimness are also being contested and shut down. So this creates a kind of a global Islamophobia, which of course then has local elements and aspects to it, as in local conditions, people express their Islamophobia in different ways. But it has also some common themes and threads running around it. So when, for example, the ultra-right in the world now expresses itself, whether it's in the United States or in Europe or even in Muslim countries, it often does so in opposition to particular kinds of Muslimness. It often wears those kind of guises. So suddenly you have this convergence around Islamophobia, which is local. So it means a Muslim woman or a Muslim man being attacked in the street, or legislation preventing particular ways of Muslims expressing themselves, or going through airports now as a Muslim, it creates as a whole machinery around that. But then there are also more general and roles and regimes throughout the world. Now that just means that now you have a situation between where 20 to 25% of the population of the planet becomes disenfranchised from its particular structures. And then how does it express itself? How do areas or things of concern to it find a response? And that is a problem not just for the Muslims who experience it, but I would say it's a problem for the world itself, because many of those aspects, that kind of lack of accountability, means that you have a disengagement and a delegitimization of those processes which are meant to try and achieve some kind of harmony. So I would say to you that is one aspect of this, which is really the convergence at the global level around how things should be done, and the inability of voices of dissent or opposition to feel that they can affect those decision-making around their lives.
Well, thank you very much, Salman Sayyid, for setting the framework for our discussion today. Before I move on to Alvaro Rodriguez, I just want to inform you that as a speaker, Deputy Foreign Minister of Turkey, Mr. Yavuz Selim Kıran, will join us a little bit later on, and we will also try to listen to his take on these issues. I just would like to move on to Alvaro Rodriguez and ask him what his introductory remarks would be on such issues, because Salman Sayyid has told us that there is a hegemonic political system in the world, and minorities, people with race, with color, including Muslims, they cannot be part of that system. How much do you agree with Salman Sayyid? And if you agree, what could be done to resolve such sort of issues of alienation, exclusion, etc., that cause, let's say, the fall of the social system in many places? The floor is yours, Alvaro Rodriguez.
Thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be with this TRT event. It's really a wonderful opportunity to participate yet again, and congratulations to all that are part of this incredible effort. I think to a large part, indeed, I would agree with what Salman Sayyid has noted. I think that since the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the end of what was a clear divide between the Soviet bloc and the Western bloc, with, I think, a third world highly marginalized, we've seen a whole range of new attempts to try and dominate values and principles and policies around the world. And of course, a lot of that centers on this very intense process of globalization. So I think in general terms, I would agree. But I guess I would complement his very good response with some positions that I think reflect the views as they come out from the United Nations and the dialogue with member states and with communities. And I think that what that highlights is that there are a number of additional dimensions that create anxiety. And from that point of view, let me elaborate on this a bit. For us, we view that the COVID pandemic has amplified and magnified many problems that were there before. Of course, there's a unique health dimension to this pandemic, which we have yet to see at the end of, and we certainly hope that that will happen soon. But I think it's amplified the fact that large populations are not only excluded in terms of having voice and being able to express their religion or their ethnicity in any which way they wish to choose, but there's been a huge economic exclusion as highlighted by the growing inequalities. And some of this incidentally has to do with the perverse use of gross domestic product as almost the only measure of success. But that, of course, is an average. And that average masks many disparities within countries and, of course, between countries. So there's economic dimension. There's, of course, a huge dimension that is also environmental, that is leading to population displacement, to famine, to drought, to floods, to fires. We've seen some of that in Turkey. And I think you have large segments of population in different countries, particularly marginalized groups, and Salman has mentioned at least one of them, but the others, of course, such as women, that are hugely adversely affected by these changes. These changes do not impact everyone equally. They do not impact men and women equally. They do not impact the young, adults, and the elderly equally. And policies around the world, including the social policies that you mentioned, Talip, simply do not have the level of traction with those groups that are being left behind to highlight that. So I mentioned economic and environmental, but there are new ones that we also see emerging. We're seeing a technological divide where those of us that are fortunate can access extraordinary technologies, including have the TRT World Forum online for everybody to access. But so many people don't even have the most basic mobile telephony. And so we have that as well, becoming another divide. And there are many others. We could discuss, for example, topics related to conflict, to refugees, to migration. So my feeling is that what is happening around the world is that you have some common ideology, I think as mentioned by Salman, that I think is presented as something that is good for everyone. But as the time goes by, in different societies, it is not touching everyone. And in fact, it is not a minority that is being untouched. In some countries, it is actually the majority that is being untouched. For example, one of the challenges that we always encountered during the pre-Berlin Wall collapse was the fact that there was a West that was more democratic than maybe the countries in the Soviet bloc. And again, we can have a debate over that, but grosso modo, we can put that there. And it was felt that there would be a real growth of democracies in the 90s, and there was. But now we're seeing a reversal as well. So even when it comes to democratic transition, we're seeing that we're falling behind. And this involves, in some cases, the entire country. These are not just marginalized groups. these are citizens marginalized almost on their entirety. So I think from the UN's point of view, and of course all of you would know this, is that as a member state organization, our principal role, of course, is to promote dialogue. Member states are better or less good at representing the challenges and demands of their citizens in global fora. So we have a challenge that the dialogue between member states is not enough. It's necessary, but not sufficient. We need much greater attention on dialogue with others, whether it's women, sexual minorities, those that feel discriminated because they follow Islam or follow Judaism, or in some cases, even other religions that are quite small that many of us are less familiar with. We need dialogue with young people so that we can understand better their views in terms of how they see their role as future leaders. So what we're seeing now is an expansion of the dialogues that are taking place within societies based on our common agenda. A recent report of the Secretary General that will hopefully lead to discussions at country level, regionally and globally on what is the world we really want. Now, why is this important? And I'll conclude on this point, is that from the development perspective of the UN, not so much the political or the peacekeeping, some of the other dimensions, but the actual development dimension, which I think is the one of broadest coverage globally. We are in pursuit of implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, which, as you know, follow the Millennium Development Goals that we had before. And COVID, but not only COVID, has shown that we will not reach these goals in many places around the world, and we will not reach them for many communities. So we need a new way to address public policy in all of its dimensions. And what I hope, or what the UN hopes, is that over the next few years, given some of the opportunities that have been brought about incidentally by COVID because of the incredible exclusion that this has highlighted, that we will be able to be more inclusive in the way we develop and adopt public policies. And of course, this then becomes, hopefully, part of the solution to the terrible problems of racism and polarization that we see now becoming worse, because it's certainly not getting better. But thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Alvaro Rodriguez, for sharing us your personal views and the UN position on the issues that we are covering. Now, let me move on to Nadia Abu-Zahra. Nadia, Alvaro mentioned a number of things. I think the issue on women and youth are quite central to our debate, because minorities, people who were marginalized, yes, they are excluded many times, but women within such communities, they are, I think, much more affected. And COVID-19 has increased disparities, the level of exclusion, etc. Would you like to bring gender perspective into our discussion, if you like, Nadia? You can turn your mic on.
I will. Thank you very much. I would return a little bit to where all of this discussion began, with the notion of post-Cold War dynamics. And I would take us back a little bit and say that if we're having a discussion about racism and about violence, I would take us back even earlier, and I would think about the long history of colonialism, which is ongoing. And without understanding that history, we can't understand the fact that it is ongoing and the way in which it's ongoing. And I'll give a metaphor, and then I'll give an example, and then I'll bring us up to the question that you asked at the moment. So here's the metaphor. I think some of us may have experienced passing through an airport, being taken to the side, put into a room, almost flush with the wall. It's like a magic trick. No one even realizes the door is there. You disappear in this airport, and everyone else passes quickly with no consciousness that you're being detained in a room, questioned, with your rights violated, and so on. This happens very frequently, and anyone it's happened to will understand the next time they go through an airport, they will look for the door, the cracks in the wall that are invisible. They will look for the colors of the passports that are taken aside. They will notice someone quietly being taken away while everyone else is given leave to pass through. And so this I'm using as a metaphor as to what happens to some people but not to others, the privileges that are given to some passing through quickly at the expense of others who are detained without the knowledge of all of the other passersby. And I think this is a great metaphor for the way that structural racism affects some people but not others, and the people who it does not affect have no, perhaps, sense. Sometimes they witness and they disregard it. It's all right, they're authorities, they're doing the right thing, can't question this. But sometimes they do not witness. And it is that invisibility to those who are not, firsthand experiencing the bombing of their countries, the breaking down of their water systems, and so on and so forth. So now to go back to the notion of what's happening since post-Cold War, I would take us back to the 1600s and to talk about racism in the 1600s. So I'm located at the moment on the unceded Algonquin territory. The Algonquin Nation is one of many First Nations who signed treaties or did not sign treaties with the Crown, the British Crown. And so the territory that I'm located on is internationally recognized as the colonial state of Canada. And yet the indigenous peoples, the indigenous nations, did not, in many cases, cede their territory. There was no intention to say, we're no longer a nation, we no longer have claims to the lands and the waters here. And so one of the mechanisms to obtain the lands and the waters was residential schools, which many people have now eventually heard of outside of Canada. These lands are called Turtle Island by the Algonquin and other Anishinaabe peoples. And so outside of Turtle Island, people are beginning to understand that in 2015, Justice Murray Sinclair estimated that up to 6,000 children had been abducted and killed or died out of neglect and harm in these residential schools that they were taken to. People no longer call them residential schools, they call them prison camps and detention centers, and even with reference to death, because so many children died. And in the recent 2 years, people who are not First Nations have begun to open their eyes to the many mass graves that are scattered about the country. And so bringing us up to the present, this complicity with ongoing colonialism is these passersby in the airport, the people who are not understanding what is happening, or worse, understanding it and not taking action to stop it. And so in the context of that, for example, there are now more children who have been abducted from their parents and placed into someone else's care, very often institutional care, than at the height of residential schools. In other words, the abduction of First Nations children is ongoing and an issue that continues. So how do we think of the future? How do we think of what should come next? Well, it's important to regard the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and the issue, which I have not spoken about yet, and the issue of residential schools and today's situation, which is having so many children in care, to turn it on its head. And instead of to say only that this is what is happening to victims, these kind of faceless, nameless victims, is to recognize the agency and the resurgence of First Nations that is happening, that is actually of benefit to all peoples. And this can be said not only for First Nations on Turtle Island, but it can be said for the Indigenous peoples of Palestine, for the Indigenous peoples of Iraq, for the Indigenous peoples of Libya, for the Indigenous peoples of Morocco, and all Indigenous peoples around the world are recognizing we have strength. We have strength, we have agency. We are women, we are children, and we have movements. There is a 25,000 person strong movement of children currently taking place in search of justice and in search of a better future. Jordan's principle was on the basis of a child and the child's rights. And Shannon's legacy, a legacy of Shannon Kustatchwin, is one of a young person who advocated and lobbied for the rights to education, clean water, and not only at survival level, but flourishing. She advocated for flourishing, and she was a child. And so I think it's really wonderful, first, to pay attention to, yes, the vulnerability of women and girls around the world, but also to pay attention to their agency in Libya, in Palestine, and around the world.
Well, thank you very much, Nadia. I think you have made excellent statements, but one thing remained in my mind, that is the ongoing colonization. I think that is something also alluded by Alvaro and Salman in different ways. Now I would like to turn to Khaled Beydoun. Khaled, you have been working on racism, Islamophobia, and exclusion of minorities. Let me turn to you in terms of establishing a better ground for further discussion. What are the critical moments, events, and ideologies that have contributed to polarization in the societies, as you can see, that goes beyond the nation-state boundaries today? The floor is yours, Khaled. You can turn your mic on. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really excited to be in conversation with the speakers, but also the discussants. I spent some time this morning thinking about how to prepare my initial remarks, and I wrote something, but then scrapped it after receiving an email this morning from a former student of mine who is now a lawyer and who was once progressive, but has shifted entirely toward the fringe right. And then I realized I taught a class called Critical Race Theory many years ago, of which he was a student. I realized that I sort of sit between this position where I'm in the middle of two movements that intersect, but many people don't understand how they intersect in very violent ways. I'm a critical race theorist. I came into law school with the principal objective of studying critical race theory, and specifically to introduce the experience of Muslims and Muslim Americans in the post 9/11 moment to this broadening discourse on critical race theory in the wake of the 9/11 terror attacks. I was a law student 2 weeks after the 9/11 terror attacks came into play. And obviously now we're 20 years after that moment and 20 years into the global war on terror, which has mutated and metastasized in ways that were unimaginable 20 years ago. And the reason I bring up critical race theory and your introduction of myself as somebody who examines Islamophobia is I'm somebody who obviously writes on Islamophobia, national security, and the First Amendment in the United States. The First Amendment is the cornerstone of the American Bill of Rights, which extends a whole host of rights, including the free exercise of religion, and including the idea that the state cannot establish one religion as the official sort of creed or faith of the land. And currently in the United States, this sort of bubbling and swelling movement of white supremacy is one that is similarly directing its angst at critical race theory. There's a host of legislation proliferating across the United States at the level of state governments that are looking to ban critical race theory by way of legislation. And they're framing critical race theory as this new sort of ideological, intellectual boogeyman that is conflated with the Black Lives Matter movement, that is conflated with wokeism, and that is conflated with anything that is attacking the establishment, the entrenchment of white supremacy as a political and epistemological system here in the United States. And the reason critical race theory is so focal to my early remarks is this very movement that is currently attacking critical race theory for the last decade and beginning in 2010 was attacking Sharia law, right? The very same elements, the very same organizations, the very same voices that are looking to ban critical race theory today were gallivanting from state to state across the South, but not only the conservative South, but also in the Midwest, where I live in Michigan, which you may know is, kind of the symbolic capital of Arab and Muslim America, the East and the West, looking to ban Islamic law, Sharia law, through state-based legislation. And again, the very same elements that were keen on abolishing race consciousness within education wanted to do so with Islam under the premise that the United States, when they talk about the United States and America, that's always synonymous with white America, is being taken over by Black folk now, being taken over by Muslims and immigrants. And the new legal strategy, which is very much a mode of political or legal populism, is to introduce law which makes it criminal, and which also introduces elements within institutions of great significance. public education, high schools, primary schools, secondary schools, universities and colleges, but also law schools where I teach, where legislation is essentially activating, or words that we might recognize, radicalizing students to essentially keep tabs on their teachers, to keep tabs on their classmates, to keep tabs on their professors, to not address content, not address subject matter that is tied to Islamic law or tied to critical race theory. So beyond this being just a ideological movement, beyond this being just, beyond this being a cultural sort of movement happening on the national level, but also the global level, this is very much a legal movement as well, where elements that are really concerned with protecting whiteness, but also, what Cheryl Harris, pioneer critical race theorist, called the whiteness of property, the idea that whiteness carries with it considerable value and property, is to use legal channels. And this is not novel, obviously. This has been, the story since the very inception of settler colonial states like the United States, to use the law as a vehicle and use the law as a weapon to maintain white supremacy because of this rising white anxiety that minorities and Muslims are taking over the country, and that are not only taking over the country, but are remaking the country. And by country, I mean countries at large, the United States, Canada, European nations, settler colonial states like New Zealand and Australia, by way of demographics. There was a Pew study a couple of years ago in the United States, which is often cited by white supremacist elements, where the country is going to become majority minority in 2045. That is roughly 2 decades from now. And that has become a critical talking point amongst white supremacists in the United States, but also globally, that they have to do something in order to sort of quell and to curb the absorption of Muslims and non-whites into the country by way of immigration, but also to sort of suppress the influence of minorities and Muslims politically, culturally, and so forth and so on. And the unfortunate reality and the nefarious reality is that these elements are becoming far more keen and far more clever with capitalizing on legal mechanisms to do that. So I have much more to say. I'm going to stop there because I'm really excited to interact with the remainder of the speakers and to discuss. I think for me, what I really am keen on discussing is how the law is very impactful in sort of not only activating and sort of authorizing the white anxiety and violence we see globally, but also protecting it.
Khaled, thank you. Thank you very much for your intervention. Our speakers have finished their interventions. Now we can move on to our discussants. And I also would like to welcome them to our session. Thank you very much for joining us. Let's start with Musab Iqbal, who is a lecturer at the University of Westminster. Iqbal, I'm not going to ask you a question because I think we have already have many topics, issues, and probably concepts that we can engage. Feel free, you have got 5 to 8 minutes as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me, and 5 to 8 minutes seems generous for a discussant. I want to pick 2 issues, one about closure of imagination, and second, which Khaled was talking about, that how law is weaponized, because I come from India and my early childhood memory is demolition of the mosque. And when you look back to see those who were criminals at that time is the rulers. And as a social scientist, we think, how did it happen within just less than 3 decades? I just want to highlight 2 things. One is the question of technology, because closure of imagination is not just political question, it's a philosophical question as well. It reminds me of Maulana, who says that Admi deed ast, baqi gosht to post. So man is vision and rest is all bones and flesh. And what if there is a closure of a vision? And technology, as we see, is leading to that closure of vision, and weaponized in a certain way. And we do not need to go in great detail to know how Facebook and Twitter and WhatsApp is being weaponized between ethnic minority clashes in Sri Lanka, in Burma, in India in particular. The recent whistleblower has disclosed how much Facebook India has been actively promoting hate and has been very instrumental. Look at the routine violence of mob lynching. And mob lynching is made possible through technological empowerment, if you want to use that quote. So the access to technology is also a kind of a serious question, not just the digital divide and who does not get it, but who gets it, on what condition he gets it. Cow vigilante groups is another kind of using Facebook and WhatsApp and mobilizing it. Second thing is the nature of the state itself. I mean, the nature of the state is shifting and changing, and it is becoming much more authoritarian. And we cannot obviously dissect all the reasons here, but weaponizing law, someone recently wrote a very good piece on Hindu nationalism in India, calling that we should stop comparing right-wing Hinduism with fascism. We should rather compare it with Jim Crow laws in America in 50s and 60s, because that's what's happening, that you are making laws, love jihad law, which is absurd. It sounds absurd, but there is a law there that Muslim man should not marry. And there are moral policing everywhere now to stop even mingling of two communities. It has started from South Indian state of Karnataka and Kerala, where the routine violence involves Muslim man or Hindu woman talking, or Hindu man and a Muslim woman talking. But now it's kind of a routine thing that slowly this mob policing, obviously administered and controlled by state, is leading to a situation where the state is becoming more and more violent, and through law, weaponizing law, and directly as well, reproducing, as Nadia was saying, I mean, reproducing the colonial system. Whether you see Kashmir, that for 1.5 years, there's a curfew, and there is a blackout of technology, there is no access to technology. And then there are technological empowerment of masses, which is assisting authoritarian state to maintain a state of polarization. So I would just end here with a phrase, a metaphor from Camus, where he says about modern man in some way, is that he lives in an auto-intoxication. So through technology, that auto-intoxication is made possible. And that auto-intoxication also kind of determines the nature of a state itself. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Musab, for your intervention. Now, I would like to welcome Deputy Foreign Minister of Turkey, Yavuz Selim Kıran, who just joined us. Minister Kıran, thank you very much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you here at our panel. Actually, we have been discussing the roots causes of racism, culture wars, and the polarization. We have mentioned a number of things, but also we are looking at the current status and what could be done in order to avoid further polarization. I just would like to ask you your take on the origins, current status, and the possible solutions, given the fact that Turkey itself, I think, is a country which has more than 5 million refugees and immigrants, but still trying to keep the solidarity, I think, cohesion within the country, within the nation state, despite the fact that it is located in a volatile region. What is your take on these issues, Minister Kıran? You have got 5 to 8 minutes, and the floor is yours.
Okay. It is very glad to see you. I miss you a lot.
Thank you.
It is glad to see the other participants, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to congratulate TRT World Forum for this very successful organization. And I thank all those contributed to this event. It's a pleasure to be with you here today to discuss the consequences of an increasingly polarized world on global politics and on our lives. We are very much concerned to observe rising levels of polarization in our wider geography and beyond. The last decade, unfortunately, has seen a shift from a one-world ideal to a more inward-looking world. Optimistic perspectives on globalization are neutralized by polarized public opinions. We can name this as a new age of polarization. this new era is built on extreme inequality. It is fed by economic disparities, competition for natural resources, and environmental challenges. COVID-19 pandemic has further worsened this outlook. For instance, it has tarnished the UN goal to end poverty by 2030. Last year, the number of people living in poverty increased for the first time in 3 decades. Today, income of the top 1% of the world population is 140 times higher than income of the bottom 50%. Rising economic inequalities have negative impacts on social cohesion. As a result, divisions based on ethnicity, religion, culture, origin are used to create division in society. Polarization manifests itself in different forms. We witness domestic political stalemates more often. Government institutions are increasingly weakened. International institutions become victims of the polarized public opinions, also due to their structural inefficiencies. Number of vetoed Security Council resolutions doubled in last 5 years compared to previous 5 years. Lack of unified international action in Syria, Afghanistan, Libya, Yemen, and Palestine caused human suffering and mass migration. This power vacuum gives more space to ill-intentioned groups like terrorist organizations and extremists. They try to attract more people by nurturing polarization. Some radical right groups in the West also take advantage of this situation. Populist politicians and media act as enablers of these groups. Willingly or unwillingly, they fuel discrimination and racism. We see alarming developments in the United States and Europe in this direction. The attempts to restrict the legal movements like grey walls by Western governments are unacceptable. It is unfortunate that those who advocate the freedom of expression easily restrict this freedom when it relates to the others. As a result of such a discrimination, dangerous trends of intolerance, hostility, xenophobia, Islamophobia shake the foundation of societies. Islamophobia is one of the most common manifestations of racism and xenophobia today. The UN and the Council of Europe reports confirm that Islamophobia has become a widespread threat on a global scale. It is on the rise, especially in Europe. Burning the Holy Quran and tearing it up, drawing cartoons insulting our Prophet under the name of freedom of the press are only a few of the attacks on our values. This dangerous trend has very alarming consequences. First of all, racist and anti-Islamic attacks have recorded an increase of 2.5 times in the last 5 years. The number of deaths in those attacks have increased 7-fold. Secondly, racism, populism, and anti-Islamism are becoming important obstacles to the integration of Muslims in Europe. In almost every European country, a job seeker with a Western-sounding name has more chances to get an interview than an applicant with a Muslim name. We see that Muslims in Europe are blamed by the far right for economic problems, irregular migration, extremism, and terrorism. But on the contrary, Muslims themselves are the victims of these problems. Discrimination in employment, education, and many aspects of social life trigger the tendency of introversion within the migrant communities. And we end up with a more fragmented and more polarized society. Thirdly, anti-Muslim rhetoric damages the Europe perception and its relations with the Muslim world. However, efforts to institutionalize Islamophobia and xenophobia in Europe for the sake of short-sighted political interests continue. Western countries categorize their own Muslim citizens as a community that should be controlled by law. They try to impose an artificial understanding of Islam. They enforce anti-Islam practices by law on education, prayers, and headscarf bans. These attempts sow the seeds of further polarization and discrimination. Our fight against Islamophobia and racism has direct repercussions for our 6.5 million citizens abroad. It is therefore an important part of the work of our ministry under the instructions of our Minister Mevlüt Çavuşoğlu. Our President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan makes sure that the issue remains a priority on the international agenda. We are leading efforts to fight against Islamophobia and all kinds of discrimination within the Council of Europe, OECD, OIC, and the UN. The threats fueling polarization and discrimination can no longer be ignored. They require urgent action, both at national and international level. We need to address the root causes, support the victims, as well as document and report the cases. We, as the Turkish Foreign Ministry, are monitoring the Islamophobia cases and drafting a report. Dear friends, it is our responsibility not only to fight racism as a global concern, but also stand up against discrimination wherever we see it. Racism, xenophobia, Islamophobia create a cycle that increases the risk of social polarization. We should always be reminded dialogue, mutual respect, and understanding are key for overcoming our differences. The COVID-19 pandemic showed us how interdependent and interconnected we are. At a time when vaccines, humanitarian aid, or irregular migration are weaponized by some, we will continue implementing an enterprising and humanitarian foreign policy. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Minister Kran. And I would like to take the liberty of being the moderator to ask you a question, if I may. You have, I think, drawn a very, let's say, pessimistic picture when we look at the events that are taking place. Minister has gone, I think. Am I right? I cannot see him. Probably he doesn't hear us. There he is. Okay. Minister Kran, I just would like to ask a question to you, because you have shared with us quite a pessimistic world. And I think Salman, Sayyid, Nadia, Khaled, Alvaro, the four speakers, they have also mentioned some of the structural problems actually that we have in the world system that contributes to exclusion, polarization. What would be the steps that you would like to really recommend to find some solutions to these pressing issues? Because we have got all these structural issues on the one hand, but as you said, Turkish Foreign Ministry are making a lot of efforts. But what would be the roadmap that you would like to recommend to the international community?
Talip Hocam, when we met with our colleagues from the European or American communities, they're always putting a public opinion debate on in front of us. And I and my colleagues always emphasize that we have also public opinion. You should not provoke public opinion by feeding far-right movements in your society. On the contrary, we should feed the central politics in all our countries and societies. When we push and when we motivate and when we encourage the central policies, then we can earn our public opinion easily, I think. That's why encouraging the central policies, following the central policies, and not provoking the public opinion by feeding the far-right and xenophobic movements, then things become more easily to solve, I think. So, of course, there are so many reasons to become pessimistic, but there are also some reasons to be optimistic. So, as Turkey, we are always, of course, we should raise all kinds of problems in the international agenda. This doesn't mean that we are pessimistic and we are giving in. So we are also pushing the optimistic picture in front of the humanity. So we should follow the. We should be the part of a solution, not part of the problem. So this is the essence of. This is also the essence of the central parties in the Western Europe as well. So the main and only, I think the first and foremost thing that we should encourage is the prevalence of the central parties in the European societies.
Well, thank you very much. At least now we end up with some optimistic, I think, observation. Thank you very much, Mr. Kran. I understand that the minister will leave us today. Thank you very much for your participation and intervention in our debate, Mr. Kran. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Talip Hocam.
Well, have a nice time. Bye-bye. Now, let's move on to Mariam Mahmoud. She is Associate Director at the Edward Cadbury Center for the Public Understanding of Religion at the University of Birmingham. Mariam, you can pick on any areas that you would like to see significant to discuss today. Please feel free, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, firstly, to the organizers for arranging this event, and to my fellow speakers and to discussants as well. This is something that I want to do is, instead of posing questions, I'll kind of respond a little bit to each of the speakers along the themes of racism, culture wars, and finally, polarization. So just along those themes, I'll just bring out a few points that I thought were worthy of mentioning. So on racism, of course, when Professor Sayyid was speaking, I noticed a few things that were really, really pertinent, I suppose. You know, this idea of the stigma and securitization faced by Muslims around the world. It's very much a global phenomenon indeed. But I think one thing just to add to that is, you know, minorities within minorities as well. So we have anti-Black racism within our own communities, within our own myths. And I think when we are, you know, preaching that we need to be open and we need to be, you know, we need to have a seat at the table. Like even today on our panel and our discussants, we don't have, you know, anyone who is of a Black heritage. That's just a point worth mentioning. I'm not suggesting that all the time we need to have a token representative or something, but you know, it is really, really important that equality, diversity, we practice what we preach. That's essentially what I wanted to say here. Just going to Alvaro, thank you so much for pointing out this issue of anxiety within communities. And, you know, as a result of COVID, for instance, pre-existing issues have been exacerbated, most definitely. And it creates a lot of hostility and distrust within community. So I, in one of my day jobs, with one of my hats on, I train faith leaders across the UK on social challenges that they face. Now, bringing them to the table on matters regarding interfaith and getting them to dialogue and debate in a very respectful and safe environment is very, very complex in the case with COVID happening. But we also found some silver linings that we learned from each other. You know, different communities were forming food banks together. We had Muslims opening food banks in churches. So, you know, of course, people of faith, you know, who I've worked with have really been very good at bringing together marginalized groups. I think I'm going to move now to a little bit about culture wars. So when I was asked to be part of this discussion, I thought about this and, you know, what does culture wars actually entail? And, you know, I came across this interesting survey conducted by the Times Radio UK, and it found that 76% of people in the UK who were surveyed did not even know what the term meant. 15% guessed it wrongly. So only 7% of those who were asked could actually understand it to mean something about rival or competing ideologies and conflict over identities, etc. So I thought this was something, you know, we can sit in these, you know, ivory towers or silos or little policy spaces, but what about the average person on the street? Do they even know what's going on? How far are they clued up on this? And I think a few things came to mind that, you know, sometimes culture wars as a term is used to attack multiculturalism. It is used to detract. So framing it with as culture, I think this goes to Nadia's point about agency, which I really, really admired, you know, this recognition of agency, not just of those who are being targeted for different forms of prejudice, but also those who are at the other side of the spectrum, maybe, you know, entertaining this bigotry, that, you know, framing it as culture wars does detract from the agency of all those involved, I feel, because, you know, who is carrying this out? Where is this war being taking place? Culture is in fact just a vessel or a process that we choose to utilize as individuals and communities. So how is this different? This would probably be a question. How is a culture war framing any different from a clash of civilizations thesis, right? And it also implies this idea of a dominant traditional culture that's somehow being eroded and people feel threatened, when in reality, there are two things that I think are worth pointing out that have been alluded to by my the speakers before me, that there is a power imbalance within society. So there's the structural issues as well, but trying to set things straight. And as Alvaro was saying about marginalized peoples, and also what Nadia was saying about, you know, indigenous communities, that when we are trying to rectify the problem, in fact, using things like culture wars is a way to stifle that progress. It's a way to kind of mitigate any of sort of the channels of access that we're trying to engage and open. Secondly, we need to ask ourselves, does culture motivate us, or is it that, you know, culture is a means to an end? I think personally, although we're talking about ideologies, etc., what's underpinning all of this is values. And that's something that hasn't been mentioned yet, which kind of determines where we slot in on the various different political cleavages, or as Khaled's point about the polarization of different extremist voices. I really appreciated the point you made about being in the middle. You know, I often think of myself in that position as well, where we have all of these people on various different ends that we're trying to bring together in order to achieve, as what Salman Sayyid was saying about harmony, you know, and finding it very difficult because, you know, Khaled mentioned this point about the voices that are now rushing to critique critical race theory are the same voices that were challenging supposed Sharia law. And I find that very interesting because a point that I would add to this is that the polarization of these extremist voices or narratives hasn't just stigmatized Muslims or certain communities. I often find, as this is to my point about values, that people on different ends or different extremes, ideologically speaking, for instance, people who are far-right extremist, white supremacists, you would never see them engaging or you wouldn't expect them to interact or engage with traditionalist, one would even say the word extremist, firebrand Muslims. However, I have a few examples of certain people who are coming together based on their supposed values. So in the UK, earlier, I think this month, I came across a poster of an event that basically was bringing together a speaker from Britain First, which is a far-right nationalist white supremacist movement in the UK, along with a well-known, notorious, how should I put it, extremist Muslim. Well, he calls himself self-styled extremist Muslim, Anjem Choudhury. The two were sharing a platform. And I found that very interesting because, you know, ideologically speaking, you have supposedly a staunch traditionalist Muslim and somebody who's a far-right Judeo-Christian origin person who wants to root Muslims out of his nation. They're coming together and they're engaging in dialogue. Is this the sort of dialogue that we want to see in our spaces? That's one point. Secondly, I also came across something today, in fact, where Jordan Peterson, who is often used by certain members of incel communities, involuntary celibates who go off to, you know, kill women, he's sharing a platform with, again, misogynist Muslim men who, so this person, I don't even want to name them. So they're sharing platforms based on certain values that they hold, which are basically a very staunch interpretation of what not benevolent patriarchy, but a patriarchal structure that they wish to uphold. Along with that, just right out misogynistic views. So what I want to say from this is, yes, we see polarization, but as a result of that polarization, we see people coming together based on very extremist narratives and values. That's not to say that people aren't coalescing on good values. So I gave the example earlier about people in faith-based communities who are coming together and unifying to, eradicate the sort of after effects of COVID within our spaces. But I think it's up to us to really gauge what we want to see in the future. Do we want to see a world where people are converging on very radical, sort of extremist, firebrand and hate-filled rhetoric? Or do we want a world that really values and cherishes harmony and tolerates and accepts differences? So again, I think what I'll leave with here, because I feel I've spoken for quite some time, is when we discuss solutions, people often rush and say, oh, well, we should talk about educating the masses. We need to make accessible content. But how are we supposed to do this when there is a lack of willingness and trust? How are we expected to engage in civil discourse? What I want to finish on is what everyone was saying about, we need to have respectful spaces. It's crucial that we form some consensus and trust building, but we need to ask ourselves, how are we intending to do that? Is it through mitigating differences, which I don't think is possible or the right way? It should be through accepting differences and cherishing them and realizing that in a pluralistic society, differences exist even within minority spaces and within the marginalized. Muslim women in a diaspora and sense, etc. So I think we need to acknowledge that there will be differences. It is about creating safe spaces and respecting and tolerating difference in order for us to, move forward and resolve these tensions. So I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for responding to some of the speakers and also raising important questions, although you have left them unanswered. I think we might discuss it later on if we have got some more time in the second round. Now, I just would like to move on. Sakhar Khamis, Associate Professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Maryland, College Park. Sakhar, thank you very much for joining us today. And the floor is yours. Feel free to respond, to raise questions, or to bring new perspectives into our discussion, please. Floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's indeed an honor and a pleasure to participate with you all in this important and timely TRT World Forum. I want to thank the organizers, and I want to thank all the presenters and the discussants as well. I want to start from the point about the conflating effect, which Dr. Khaled Beydoun was talking about when he was talking about the fact that the white supremacists and those who are right-wing extremists, they think of the conflating effect of people who are trying to fight Islamophobia with those who are also members of the Black Lives Matter movement and also members of the hashtag #MeToo movement and so on. I want to talk about the conflating effect of the parallel rise of these polarizing movements on the other hand. It is not really a coincidence that these movements of extremism, racism, right-wing politics, white supremacy, polarization, racism, that they're all existing at the same time. I think that there is definitely, it's not a coincidence, there is definitely a conflating effect in that sense that they're feeding into each other and somehow enabling and empowering each other, not locally or regionally, but globally and internationally. That's a very important point that we have to bear in mind if we try to understand how these movements are working. And at the heart of all of these movements is also the idea or the phenomena of othering with a capital O. They're looking at others. If you looked at some of the white supremacists who were marching in Charlottesville, Virginia, the slogans were, fighting Islam, Muslims will not replace us, Jews will not replace us. They were putting people in the same group or the same parcel as others, whether they are minorities, whether they're immigrants, whether they're Muslims, or whether they are Blacks or Jews. And that is a very important point because it takes me to the second point, which is the fact that we should understand that Islamophobia, which Professor Beydoun and myself as well have been writing about for quite a while now, is not a singular, detached, or isolated phenomena. It is indeed one branch of an overall tree, a very dangerous tree of hatred to others. And that includes things like anti-Semitism, hatred to minorities, to Asians, to Blacks, to Latinos, to many different minority groups. And that's the way we should see it. And if we understand it this way, we'll understand that justice is not just for us. Indeed, we should work in solidarity and in coordination with other groups in order to fight all of these underlying and threatening evils. So it's not just about the fight of course, countering Islamophobia that we are all concerned about, but it's equally important as well to join hands and to work in solidarity and in coordination with all of these groups who are also marginalized and othered by those who are white supremacists or extremists or right-wing politicians and so on. So that's my first point. My second point has to do with invisibility. And I was very touched by what Dr. Nadia Abu-Zahra had to say about this invisibility in the airport and this kind of visual image that she gave us. I've been studying also gender and women's studies, which is my area of specialization as well, along with media and communication. And I always talked about multiple layers of invisibility on three important levels. In academia, in the media, and in socioeconomic and political and infrastructural realities as well. So if you talk about academia, indeed, you can say that there is definitely marginalization of many different voices, including, Muslims, women, Blacks, minorities, and so on in academia. The same could be said about media, which I'll talk about in more depth and details as my area of expertise in a moment. And of course, in the overarching and overall political and socioeconomic structure, and even in the infrastructure as well. Mr. Rodriguez has been talking about the digital divide. His Excellency, the Minister, talked about the impact of COVID-19. Definitely, there has been the amplifying effect of all of these different gaps and all of these different invisibilities and all of these different marginalizations as a result of the overarching socioeconomic and political system, and also the infrastructure. When we talk about something like digital divide, for example, we cannot assume that every citizen around the world has access to 24/7 high-speed internet, just like the one we are enjoying at the moment, and we're able to have this brilliant discussion with people across the globe. This is not the fact in many parts of the world, and it does exist between different countries as well as within the same country as well, between the rural and urban communities, and even between those who are more digitally literate and those who are less digitally literate as well. The factor of digital illiteracy is another important factor. And of course, if you talk about women in particular, you can also add another layer, which is the gender digital divide. So it's not just a digital divide in a broad sense, there's also the gender digital divide where women do not have the same access to literacy and education in general, and to the infrastructure and the technology and digital literacy in particular. Now, if you connect this to my third point, which is the impact of COVID-19, this is a very important point because COVID-19 did play a very important role in terms of amplifying and escalating many of these divisions and many of these invisibilities and many of these marginalizations, because you are seeing how certain groups are becoming more and more isolated, more and more marginalized, maybe because they are in rural areas, they have less education, or in the case of women, like I talked about, the gender digital divide. However, having said all of that, there has also been some good light or some silver lining in the COVID-19 pandemic, I must say, which is the fact that people are starting to reach out to each other. And that has been particularly very important for the Muslim community, because it's important, as I said before, to understand that justice is not just for us, and therefore we should reach out to others. And I'm now doing some work on Muslim American philanthropy in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. And it makes me very proud to see how the American Muslim community members have been trying to reach out to others outside of the American Muslim community to extend help and relief and solidarity. And that is a very, very important point, because as I said before, the conflating effect, the othering effect, it's really one challenge, it's one struggle, it's one battle. And therefore we have to join hands and create some form of solidarity if we are to overcome the problems of marginalization, invisibility, polarization, and racism that we are talking about today. And I certainly hope that there will be more and more work done in this direction of increasing solidarity and coordination and cooperation, because as ISPU research, ISPU is the Institute of Social Policy and Understanding, is doing excellent work in terms of surveying the American Muslim community, and the opinions about the American Muslim community has shown, the research showed that if you know just one single Muslim, your perceptions of Islam and Muslims change dramatically and significantly. Just one person, imagine. So whenever you reach out of your own cocoon or your own community and you create these solidarities, you are really trying to change some of these underlying invisibilities, misrepresentations, and racism as well. And now I move to my last point. As a scholar of media and communication, I cannot help but talk about the role of the media in all of that, which is very important. And here I want to distinguish between the mainstream media and the social media. The mainstream media, unfortunately, as we all know, even in the most democratic countries, is oftentimes reflecting certain agendas. So they reflect either the agenda of those who are the sponsors or the advertisers, or they reflect the agenda of certain governments and regimes. And in that sense, they have been pretty much part of the problem rather than part of the solution. Even if you look at a very democratic country like the United States of America, it's enough to watch Fox News and to watch CNN or MSNBC to realize that you are looking at two different countries or two different continents. They have a lot of polarization and a lot of gaps and a lot of differences, and do not see things eye to eye. And it's not even done in a healthy manner of engaging in diversity that's really kind of healthy or productive. It is oftentimes very toxic polarization, I must say. Of course, when it comes to Islam and Muslims and minorities, the media, mainstream media, has been doing a terrible job in terms of underrepresentation and misrepresentation of these communities, including Muslims. As we all know, of course, the impact of 9/11, and this year we have been, I will not say celebrating because it's nothing to celebrate here, but marking the 20th anniversary of 9/11, which also was paralleled by the crisis in Afghanistan. And all of that led to the surge of another dangerous and really critical wave of Islamophobia, I must say. That also was somehow affecting the kind of media coverage we are receiving about Islam and Muslims, which is pretty much adding to the problem rather than offering some form of solution. Whenever someone who has a Muslim name or an Arab name or looks Arab or looks Muslim commits any act of terrorism or extremism or whatever it may be, they receive hundreds times more coverage than a person who is just an average Joe Smith or Michael Jones or whatever it may be. In which case, yeah.
I am sorry to interrupt
I
you,
have
but
one
if
more.
you can wrap up, yes, please,
Yes,
because
sure.
we've got two more speakers.
Of course, yes. In which case the person's religion or identity or religious identity is not even mentioned. So in that sense, we can say the mainstream media are really becoming mirrors and molders of this problem. They reflect the problem and they cause the problem, or they cause the problem and they also reflect it, and they adopt the principle of when it bleeds, it leads. So whenever you have violence and extremism and war, that makes the front page coverage and makes the headlines in the news. And finally, when you talk about social media, unfortunately, the situation is not much better, I'm afraid to say, because it can be a double-edged sword effect. Yes, you can use it to fight and counter Islamophobia, racism, discrimination, and all forms of hatred, but it's also pretty much used by Islamophobes and haters and racists to launch their own campaigns all the time. So it is playing a double-edged sword effect in that sense. And finally, it also plays a double-edged sword effect in the sense of also you can have the echo chambers, which I think Dr. Mariam was talking about, the echo chambers in the sense that people can harden their own views and their own opinions by being on social media, or they can turn to the other extreme of extreme polarization and division and having some shouting matches or screaming matches and wrestling matches on the internet. They don't reach the middle ground of critical, rational deliberation and debate, which is what we are having today in a very healthy way in this forum. Thank you so much.
Shukran, Sahar. Thank you very much for your intervention.
Shukran.
Khadija Al-Shayal, she is Associate Fellow at the Al-Walid Center. Khadija, thank you very much for your patience. So we have got a long discussion, and I just would like to give the floor to you on any issues that you would like to highlight.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for having me this evening. It was a real pleasure to listen to all of my fellow panelists. Some really important points that have been raised in enriching discussions. I just want to pick up on a couple of things that others have raised and really respond and highlight a couple of areas of relevance. So going back to the tone that was set by Professor Sayyid at the beginning regarding the idea of a hegemony of neoliberalism as producing strife and tension rather than a peaceful settlement. I think that was a really apt way to sort of begin this discussion, and absolutely I concur on that point. But yeah, to tie in sort of the presentation from Nadia, this idea, I think that it's important to bear in mind that we've got neoliberalism working hand in hand with neocolonialism. Colonialism isn't something that's consigned to history or that's behind us, and its impacts are still unfolding and it's still sort of very much in progress. And the impacts of that are very much feeding into this phenomenon of polarization. To just a quick point on something which Alvaro raised around the common ideology of neoliberalism, I guess, being presented as good for everyone, but actually that it's leaving the majority untouched. I'd take that further and say, well, actually, it's not just that it's leaving a majority untouched, it's actually actively harming the majority. Resisting it is a way of actually, standing the ground for a majority which is being oppressed actively by the encroachment of neoliberalism into every area of people's everyday lives. It's not something that we can sort of say, okay, well, that's politics, or that's the state. It's seeping into the everyday lived realities of people just as they go about their daily lives, even if they don't know what culture wars are or what critical race theory is. And I think one area of this, which has been alluded to by others, but I really wanted to bring to the fore of our discussion, which I think is really emblematic of these challenges, and how this hegemony is really presenting a serious threat to our humanity and to global harmony, if you want to call it that, is the counter-extremism industry. And I use the word industry very purposefully. When we're talking about neoliberalism and the economy and market forces, it really is an industry. There's a whole grift going on there, and I'm sure many of my co-panelists are very well aware of this. In the UK, we use the shorthand PREVENT often to talk about counter-extremism, but in other countries, not just in the global West, but in the Muslim majority world as well, there are huge industries related that come under this general umbrella of counter-extremism, counter-terrorism. Now, this is something that's presented, as benevolent, because when you think about it, on a very superficial level, who wouldn't want to combat terrorism, right? Who wouldn't want to combat violence in our societies? Or from a theological or faith perspective, who wouldn't want to counter aberrant understandings or manipulations of our faith, or the values that, if we want to use sort of policy talk, values that we cherish and values that we hold dear? Who wouldn't want to fight for freedom? If to go back to sort of popular policy talk, these are all things that are presented as benevolent and in all of our interest. But actually in this industry, what we see is really at play is this hegemony of neoliberalism. We see this closure of imagination, to borrow Professor Sayyid's term. Now, in particular in the UK context, it's something I've considered and written about when you think about how Muslim organizations and Muslim activist spaces are being actively constrained and stifled and muted because of this shadow of securitization that they have to function under, because of surveillance, because of state violence and stigmatization, and how that seeps into all the areas in which they raise their voices. To go back to the privilege metaphor that Nadia used, I mean, that's a perfect example of all of this in play in a very real and relatable way that we see in our travel and on our borders. The differential way that communities are affected, how Muslims are rendered suspect communities, but also how people are just oblivious, right? As you quite aptly demonstrated in the example that you gave, if it doesn't affect you, if you have privilege, you're completely oblivious to the fact that this happens, and in your mind, counter-extremism, counter-terrorism is a very laudable thing. It keeps us safe, it keeps us secure. There's a rationalization that goes on there. Being checked at the border, we all seem to be, if you are coming from the privileged side of all of this, checks at airports are a price worth paying for our security and safety. That's how these things are rationalized. But this doesn't take into consideration, obviously, that person who is routinely stopped for a random check, supposedly every single time they travel, routinely questioned and interrogated and harassed. Is that a price worth paying? Is the suffering and the anxiety of their family a price worth paying? There's a whole other side to that people simply do not have awareness of if it doesn't affect them, right? And finally, I guess I wanted to hone in on something which features very much again in this whole counter-extremism industry, which is how women and gender issues are more generally being weaponized and held up by government structures as an arena for harsh, opaque, exceptionalizing securitization policy. And this is really founded on and nourished by enduring Islamophobic tropes. So it has this idea of Islam and Muslims as regressive, an unforgiving monolith where women are, oppressed or from before they're even born, through a cradle to the grave kind of thing. And we see this crop up in, we've talked about how, what's the difference between what's going on in France vis-a-vis Muslim organizations. We've had news today of another Muslim organization countering Islamophobia in France that's been dissolved. There's been a succession of them in recent times. What's the difference between that, as Professor Sayyid rightly pointed out, on what's going on in India, what happens in Burma, China with relation to their Muslim communities? In all of these case studies and all of these examples, we see this idea of defending women's rights and a very specific, particular strand of feminism that's raised as part of this vanguard, really, to save Muslim women as a way of sanitizing this mission to impose securitization on Muslim communities and Muslim existence in their totality. And I think this is a really sharp illustration of this hegemony of neoliberalism and how it plays out in very real ways in the everyday lives of Muslims globally in various contexts. And again, everywhere has its own sort of cultural, political, local flavor, but the common thread is very clear and very visible for everybody to see. So I'll leave it there.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for your thoughts and insights, Khadija. Now, I just would like to move on to Zeynep Koç. She is an independent researcher who has been writing on these issues. Zeynep, thank you also very much to you for your patience and your, of course, participation in the panel. Please, the floor is yours. If you would like to take on any of the issues that you would like to, feel free. You can turn your mic on, please. Yeah. Thank you.
It's great to see you again, Professor Talip, and it's great to see Ustaz Sayyid again. And it's great to see everyone here. Thank you, TRT Forum and TRT Research Center for organizing this conference and making us connected through these times of epidemic. I want to start a little bit more optimistic, and I hope I can finish it that way, maybe not really. So I want to highlight that, has there ever been a time when the world was not polarized? So think tank world has some defects, which is that it can be something like a fast fashion version of academics where you focus on the last 20 to 30 years, and it creates the illusion of whatever you are going through is very unique, that it has no point of reference and it has no connection to the past. And but if you look at a long historical approach, the world has always been polarized in one way or another. So what is important today is to look at what is the nature of polarization today and what is needed to foresee where this current risks and tensions will lead to. Given my area of study and expertise, I want to look at more Middle East, North Africa, and its relations to the Western nations from anthropological and economic point of view. If you look at MENA and Europe relations, the driver of instability has been migration. And the Arab Spring has destabilized not only the Arab nations, but also Europe through both refugees, but also by the destabilization of the Arab nations, the migrant routes got unattended. And that in itself created an influx of migrants and refugees to Europe, and it created its own instability in Europe. When Arab Spring has happened and this influx of both refugees and migrants were coming to the Europe was out of recession. It was already, 2008 recession was almost over and it was already doing well, but still the European nations and administrations, to put it in the most euphemistic terms, had minimum tolerance towards the refugees. If you look at like France, there was burning of camps, Germany, attacks on refugees, Switzerland taking on Professor Beydoun's using law as a way to stop the refugees. Switzerland had this law that they had the right to confiscate all the possessions of the refugees upon arrival. And I think they had something like only wedding rings were excluded. Anything else of financial value could be confiscated by the government upon your arrival. Italy was paying Libyan warlords to stop the migration. And so all of these were happening. And I think one thing to realize here is that when we look at now, if you bring the US in terms of Western relations in, US, I think, highlights why these things were happening. The anti-Muslim and anti-Islam rhetoric has been happening in the US for a long time, but 9/11 was obviously kind of one of the key points. Attacks at home, wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, all have been accumulating. And I think they become vocalized and embodied under Trump. If not for Trump, there would be other politicians, except maybe less flamboyant, but there would be other politicians who would be pushing for similar agenda. Because what is significant is there was root in the public for this kind of discourse. And the Trump administration showed the disillusion. I think it disillusioned the Western communities about their own nations, in the sense that they had these racist and xenophobic groups, and they were not marginal. They were not at the margins of the state. They had the power to come to the center and claim the political supremacy. And I think I wanted to give a small example. A couple of weeks after the Trump got elected, I was at the conference at Chatham House, and there were a lot of British bureaucrats, Eurocrats, middle-aged think tankers. They were all surprised. They were like, what are we going to say to the rest of the world now we have elected Trump? Noting that most of these people were not Americans, but they still identify being part of the Western nations. They're like, we, the Western nations, elected Trump. What are we going to say to the rest of the world? You could clearly see the blue screen in their eyes that was error 404. And that is saying that you can realize that Trump had experienced this refugee experience, shows that there's intrinsic groups, and they're powerful within the Western nations, and they can take center at any point. What is kind of specific about the American experience is that not only for the Western nations, but for other nations as well, it became an example that all these groups of with xenophobic and racist and hate speech rooted groups, that they had actually, being a political power was a real viable goal. Trump showed this to them. So in the world now on, I think we're going to see more of these groups coming and claiming the center. So what does it mean for economically? This is, I think, my more the political take. What does it mean economically for the future is I want to take on what Dr. Rodriguez left about what the pandemic has done to the world. There is clearly a lot less money in the world than there was before the pandemic, if you look at the production levels, anything. So there will be a lot less funds for aid and other kind of things. And the countries will be fighting for more limited resources. And that means, and also all the countries have been going for monetary expansion, which means inflation. And also it will be also fueling cryptocurrencies. I think you have seen today too, some cryptocurrencies had records today that they have never reached before. And all of these means other currencies will get weaker and weaker, and they will destabilize their own economies. All of these mean less tolerance, more rigidity in the lines of race, ethnicity, migration, and refugees. And finally, one last thing about the effect of pandemic is that there were questions about the digital divide. The pandemic increased our digital imprint for all of us. Now the governments have data about where we go, who we meet, who we contact, and which will make surveillance and monitoring a lot easier in the future. So which means harsher and more, possibly more autocratic governments in the future as well. So all in all, from what I look, it will be a less friendly world. Thank you.
Thank you, Zeynep. You have started with optimism, but ended up with a little bit pessimism. But thank you very much for your contribution. Now, we've got a few more minutes for the speakers, especially because they have now listened to you, your reactions and some of the questions that you have raised. With the same order, let's have 2 minutes for each speaker so that they can maybe share with us their final remarks. Salman, let's start with you. Can you turn on your mic, please?
That would save time. Just very quickly, there's a lot of things to say, but I'll just confine myself to one comment. Sometimes there's been a conversation around the idea of occupying or a center ground or becoming part of the center ground. I think we have to think of the center ground as not something which is geometric space in between 2 points. It's something which is actually created. And what used to be center or moderate or considered to be normal changes as a result of political struggles. And what we're seeing now is a change in what is considered to be, for example, on many, many issues, which were considered to be right-wing or becoming more and more moderate and mainstream. and it is the mainstream. So when we try and go for the center or the middle or the moderate position, we will get nowhere, because the moderate and the center and the middle have shifted so far away from where we want to be in order to have justice and freedom. So the idea really is we should be combating justice and freedom, and that means contesting the very idea that there is some kind of center ground, because there's not a center ground. It is those people who are saying that their views represent the center, they represent the common sense. That is what's at stake. And really, ultimately, what we're involved in is a political struggle for changing hearts and minds of people. Whether you call that culture wars, whether you call that hegemony, or whether you call that politics, that is it. And the only way for a better world is for people to be involved in political struggles in whatever means they can be, in whatever spaces they occupy. Without that, we just become agents of our own disempowerment and marginalization.
Well, thank you for this last observation you made. Now let's move on to Alvaro.
Thank you, and thank you to all of the panelists and discussants. It was extremely interesting. Maybe 2 points very quickly in the time that we have. One of the struggles that I have as an individual, not as an international civil servant, is to try and disentangle cause from consequence. Is the economic model, for example, that we follow leading to the types of very divisive politics that we have? And what is the feedback loop? I think we must be able to disentangle better cause and consequence, and how a consequence then becomes a cause for maybe some more regressive policies as they take place. That's something that I must admit I lose sleep over, as the expression goes. The second one, and maybe more fundamental, and maybe this I can say as an international civil servant, is that the nature of the nation state and of government therein has changed dramatically over the decades, and particularly over the last couple of decades. In a sense, it's being pulled apart from below by all of these groups that are marginalized, but not in the sense of being small. As somebody mentioned already, these marginalized groups are actually huge, and sometimes it's entire society, so we shouldn't think of them as small. They're huge parts of society that are being left behind. And then, of course, it's being pulled apart from above with divisive politics that prevent nation states from coming together on things that often make eminent common sense, like how to handle a health pandemic, and increasingly how to handle climate change. So I think these are two things that I think about and concern me, because we need clarity, maybe on the evolution, and it's that lack of clarity that I see more than the clarity in the road ahead. But thank you very much to everyone.
Well, I thank you, Alvaro. Nadia, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to listen to all speakers, and I'd like to think about the future. And thinking about the future, I'm also yet again going to go back into the 1700s. And I'm going to talk about a man named Thomas Malthus. And Malthus predicted that we would enter oblivion because of too many people. But the context was that he worked for a college affiliated with the East India Company. He was a colonist. He was in favor of colonialism and deep, deep inequality. And so now when we look at what is happening, we should remember that if we have insufficient housing in our privileged communities, if we have insufficient anything in our communities, it is not because we have opened our communities to those who we have welcomed with open arms and who former to that were more marginalized, but instead it is because we are spending our investment, our time, our value, and our money on things like fighting one another. And so let's take a page from the Black Lives Matter movement and the long-standing literature and research into abolition, and let us divest from harm and from policing, and instead of fighting one another over what we think are scarce resources with the mindset of Malthus from the 1700s working for colonialism, let us instead say, no, the world has abundance, but we need to divest from harm and policing and invest in care and communities.
Well, thank you, Nadia. Khaled, you are the last speaker to share your final remarks.
Yeah, my final remark, is, really tied to what Dr. Nadia just mentioned, and it's tied to, I think making what we talk about more accessible. What really frustrates me when speaking to members of the left, especially academics, is we talk above people and we don't connect and resonate with people on the ground, right? We don't make our work accessible, and we're frankly losing the communication war to the right. I think one thing the right does, and the right isn't monolithic, but elements on the right do really well, is they connect and they speak and they communicate in a way that communities on the ground speak. And that's one thing we don't do on the left. And if we don't sort of, grapple with our own elitism, grapple with our own desire to sound really smart and fancy, and hide behind these ivory towers that really don't reach real people on the ground, we're going to continue to lose the communication and intellectual wars or culture wars, whatever you want to call them. So for me, I spend a lot of time really thinking about making my work accessible and in making my ideas and messages palatable to lay people on the ground. And that's something I'd like to see more from academics, thinkers, politicians, and pundits, of the so-called left.
Well, Khaled, thank you very much. And I would like to thank actually all of you for your participation, first of all, and then of course, sharing your insights with us at the TRT World Forum this year on a panel titled Racism, Culture Wars, and Polarization of Global Politics. On behalf of TRT World Forum, I would like to say good one to everyone and to our audience as well. And I also would like to thank to the people who facilitated this meeting, who brought us together here. Thank you very much for your participation and have a nice time. Goodbye.